For joining us at Sharper Focus Wider Lens. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Cynthia Jackson-Elmoore, the Dean of the Honors College, and it is my pleasure meeting with you this evening, where we'll be talking about Detroit, the past, present, and future of the city. And I want to do two quick introductions. My partner in crime, who's trying to sneak away, is John Beck, and he helps coordinate all of the Sharper Focus Wider Lens, and you'll hear more from him later when we open up the discussion to the audience. And then to the back in my right is Stephanie Seapack, who is the communications manager for the Honors College and helps us get the word out about all the great things going on, and will also make sure that the video is available for others later. And I will introduce you to all of the panel. I wanted to give you a sense of what we're trying to achieve tonight. Part of the purpose behind Sharper Focus Wider Lens is to celebrate our local scholars on campus. Oftentimes when we have seminars, we bring in people from other parts of the nation or the world, and they're here and they leave, and our campus community doesn't have an opportunity to interact with those individuals beyond that night or that week. And then also we need to celebrate the people who are here doing great work. So you have a chance to see our people that are doing work, and then maybe take a class from them, do research with them, come and have dialogue with them at another time. So we hope that you know that tonight is the beginning, and that you engage and continue dialogue with each other and our panelists as you go throughout the weeks and months ahead. And so with us tonight, we have Professor Rodney Whitaker. He is Professor of Jazz Double Bass and Director of Jazz Studies in the College of Music. Dr. Whitaker is one of the leading performers and teachers of Jazz Double Bass in the nation. He is a member of the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra and has received national recognition performing with the Terence Blanchard Quintet. He has also toured internationally as a featured performer with the Roy Hargrove Quintet, and he has appeared and presented master classes at the International Association of Jazz Educators Conferences. He's featured on more than 100 recordings, from film to CDs. And Dr. Whitaker's film score, China, was directed by our own Jeff Ray and was released on PBS in 2002. In 2006, he was nominated for the Juno Award, Canada's equivalent to the Grammys, for his work, Let Me Tell You About My Day, produced by Alma Records. Whitaker collaborated with the musicians Phil Dwyer and Alan Jones on the album, which was nominated for Traditional Jazz Album of the Year. And it's my pleasure to present him to you, and I have to share that of all of the forums we've done, this one feels like Old Home Week, because I'm actually in close connection and have relationships of one sort or the other with all of our panelists here tonight. So I kind of feel like I'm hanging out with friends, and I hope after this evening you will too. Rodney?
Good evening. Can you hear me out there? Can everybody hear me out there? It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. And when I was asked to be a part of this panel, I was very excited, because if anyone knows me, my favorite subject to talk about is Detroit in any aspects. And if you look at my bio, if you ever look at anything written about me, the first two lines that it says always is basis from Detroit. And I embrace that, because it is the thing that's responsible for me being successful, the musical legacy of Detroit. When I was a kid, at the age of 13, and I'll be brief with the story, but this will provide some context. When I was a kid, I began to play bass at age 13 in middle school. And my teacher gave me a bass to take home with me, figuring that I would have more success with practicing by having one at home, which is, I think that is kind of a Detroit way of thinking about things. And I took this bass home, and my neighbor, who saw me every day carrying a violin, immediately became interested in me. He never said anything to me when he saw me with the violin, but when he saw that bass, he got excited. He ran out the house with 2 LPs, and one was an LP by the great John Coltrane, and the other one was an LP by Miles Davis. And he came up to me and he said, "Look, you play bass. I'm going to give you 2 recordings, and both bass players are from Detroit. Paul Chambers, one was one, and the other one's Ron Carter. And they both went to Cass Tech. And maybe one day you could grow up and you could go to Cass Tech. He said, you're now part of a musical legacy. And at that time, at 13, I didn't know what the word legacy meant. So I went into the house, and my mother was an avid reader, so I walked to her and I said, can you explain to me what the word legacy? She said, there's a dictionary, look it up. We didn't have Wikipedia back then. And I looked it up, and it meant to be a part of a continuum. And so that excited me. I sat up that night and I listened to those recordings over and over and over and over and over again. And I decided that day that I was going to be a part of a musical legacy. And in fact, I decided I was going to be Paul Chambers when I grew up. And for me, that started this quest. And I started to meet jazz musicians. I started to go to places where musicians were. And as I started to meet the musicians, they all gave me reading lists. Have you read this book? Have you read this book? Have you studied this? Have you ever heard of Barry Harris? And again, information wasn't readily available, so you had to go to the library and you had to do research. And for me, jazz in Detroit became a sole preoccupation. It was everything that I wanted to be interested in. So I began to study about musicians who were committed to this music. And then I started discovering that Detroit had a long history of jazz musicians. It dates back to the 1920s. We had two of the most important bands in the history of jazz from Detroit. We had the George Goldkite Orchestra, which was was a white band. And then we had an African-American band that was called the McKinney Cotton Pickers. And those were two of the most important groups in the history of jazz. From the George Goldkite Orchestra, Mick Spiderbeck and Frankie Trombone played in that band. And the McKinney Cotton Pickers, the great arranger, Gerald Wilson was a member of that band, as well as, who was one of the arrangers up there, I see his face, the great, I'm drawing a blank, I usually can do this without thinking. But he had some of the great, Fletcher Henderson's arranger is coming to me. Don Redman started in Detroit writing for the McKinney Cotton Pickers. So you see that there's a legacy. And part of the history that I also learned about music in Detroit was the fact that the two great migrations affect the kind of music that was presented in Detroit. The first migration, Detroit musicians were primarily rhythm and blues players in the early history, because that was the music that came up from the rural South. And most of the musicians that we know that are famous musicians that grew up there all were migrated from either Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and so on and so forth. But that second migration brought a huge wave of what we call bebop musicians. For example, if I name pretty much almost every jazz musician that was famous from 1950 to present day, they all have Southern roots. They all either born in Alabama, Mississippi, etc., and moved to Detroit. In fact, two of the most famous musicians that we like to claim from Detroit is a musician by the name of Joe Henderson. Joe Henderson is actually from Lima, Ohio. And Joe Henderson moved to Detroit to go to Cass Tech. Are you guys all familiar with Cass Tech? If you know anything about Detroit, that is probably the most preeminent music school in the world. It produced probably more musicians in the history of any city, with the exception of probably, I would think, Crispus Attucks and where's Crispus Attucks in Indianapolis, or William Penn High School in Pittsburgh, or in Chicago, DeSable High School. So these high schools were instrumental, especially in a city like Detroit, because they had the highest caliber music programs that existed in the country, and they were integrated. They allowed African American students to go. Gerald Wilson is now 95 years old, and he went to Cass Tech. So, if you do the math, you're talking some almost 80 years ago, he was in the integrated school system where he was allowed, he had great music lessons, he studied theory, and that education you received at Cass Tech at that time was the equivalent, really, of a college education. In fact, places like Eastman Conservatory, Juilliard would readily come and recruit students of color to go to their institution if they were from Cass Tech. Okay, The other part of being a musician from Detroit that I'd like to touch on, there's always been an entrepreneurial spirit. This was a city where many of the first jazz independent labels existed in this town. And I don't mean in the early history, but especially in the 50s, in the 1960s, there was a ton of labels. You probably remember Strata East, Strata West with Kenny Cox, who was one of my mentors. It was also a town that was noted for pedagogy. One of the greatest pedagogues in the history of jazz studies was a gentleman I alluded to earlier by the name of Barry Harris. He taught virtually almost every musician that grew up in Detroit. We were talking a couple of weeks ago, we could sit here days and days and just name musicians that he touched their life. He wasn't paid to do this, he was just committed to teaching bebop, the foundation of the music that Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, he was one of the first people who sat down and codified the form and taught people how to do it. Also, being a musician from Detroit, you had to be intelligent. You had to be a well-learned person. If they met you and you said you were from Detroit and you couldn't talk about anything other than music, then they doubted that if you were actually from Detroit. I'm almost out of time, and I know this is the start. Also, the music legacy of Detroit continues. You know, we have a building in Detroit, the Community Music School, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and various different organizations are keeping the music alive. You know, again, we have been responsible for producing great bebop musicians, rhythm and blues, gospel, and also music that I grew up on there, techno music. And so there are tons of incredible musicians that are from this town, and it's a very, very powerful legacy, and I would like to encourage you to explore it as much as you can.
Thank you. Thank you, Rodney. We're just going to go back to Bosco. Thank you, Rodney. And later we'll have a chance to ask questions of each of the panelists. And what I want to do now is put into your mind to remember to ask Rodney about each one, teach one, and owning your own product, and what that means in terms of a rich cultural history. And next, Dr. Carl Taylor is professor in the Department of Sociology, a senior fellow in University Outreach and Engagement, and MSU Extension Specialist here at the university. He has extensive experience in field research aimed at the reduction of violence involving American youth. He has taught in the School of Criminal Justice here at Michigan State University and also at Grand Valley University. Dr. Taylor has directed the Department of Criminal Justice and Public Safety at Jackson Community College, served as a clinical professor to the Grand Valley State University Criminal Justice and Police Academy, and an associate of the National Community Policing Center. Some of the organizations that Dr. Taylor has worked with include the Guggenheim Foundation, the C.S. Mott Foundation, the FBI Academy, and the Children's Defense Fund. He also serves as the principal investigator for the Michigan Gang Research Project. Dr. Taylor served on the Michigan Juvenile Justice Committee for more than 10 years and advises various projects concerning youth throughout America. Paul?
Thank you. A little sad I don't have any albums, movies, anything like that to follow up. And I'm really jealous because Professor Whitaker was in the movie Malcolm X playing at the, is it Audubon? Yeah. That's an Audubon ballroom where Malcolm was later assassinated, which I think is, every time I see the movie I point out that that's my boy, that's rapping. I don't have anything like that. My work I'm a native, like Professor Whitaker, I'm a native of Detroit. I'm a product of Detroit public schools. I'm very proud of that fact. And in the same breath, I'm very sad at where public education has landed in Detroit and across this nation. Very sad what is taking place, because if there was not a solid public education system in Detroit, you would not be having Professor Whitaker or myself and others. So I'm a very big believer in public education, and that's part of the problem. We have Professor Darden here, whose new book, is that bad? Here, sure. I think that this is one of the most prolific works that gives a historical perspective of where Detroit was and where it is today, and perhaps where it's going. That's part of our gathering here today. I look at two distinct points in my research, and I've been doing this research for a long time, almost 40 years. I look at, and I have a new book coming out called The Third City. And for me, the third city is where all the people land in the underground society that can no longer fend for themselves. I hear a great deal of talk right now politically about what is taking place. And despite the bad image that Detroit has given a great deal, this was a proud, blue-collar working city. And that despite what many people think, that we have people there who went to the auto plants, and our very livelihoods depended on that auto industry. Now that that auto industry has changed, it has left many people behind. We're looking at the challenge of what takes place with the middle class as it is changing or crumbling or take your choice. What I'm not hearing, what my research shows, we're leaving a lot of people behind that we have no discussion about as it relates to poverty. I'm very disturbed by our politicians, and I'll probably get in trouble. But in any event, the fact is that we have armies of poor people in Detroit and other urban centers. It is not by accident that Flint, Michigan and Detroit, Michigan are considered the #1 and 2 most dangerous cities in America. We seem to look the other way and don't think about it, and really it's not really that difficult to understand. Flint was a boom town. It was doing great as long as the plants, the shops had employees. You look at Detroit, the same thing. It's a domino effect. Schools had taxes from the industry with the workers. You had a lot of jobs. Those jobs are gone now. Unfortunately, what we have to look at, and I point this out very strongly again, that we would not be able to have gifted musicians, gifted students, without a strong public education. I'm afraid it's gone. What replaces it? What I'm looking at is not only a great number of children who are in trouble, but I'm also looking at a lot of children in my research in Detroit. They can't drop out of school because they never dropped in. We're looking at a different type of family that again we become very sensitive and we don't want to talk about. I talk about crime. I talk about crime that has become normalized. I talk about the fact that over 3/4 of the children that I talk to over the past 30 years have no connection to any faith-based institutions. I grew up on the west side of Detroit. My father passed when I was 13. The Taylor boys belonged to the community. That meant that if our neighbors saw us doing something wrong, they got with us. They had permission to really get with us. And our only request, not begging, was that please don't call my parents. We're now dealing with a dysfunctional family that no one really wants to talk about in depth. And I think that we in the academy at times are very guilty of dressing it up, putting cosmetics on it, and giving excuses. That we're looking at the type of poverty right now that I'm looking at many folks who are squatting in homes, and they're variation. Some people will squat in a home with no running water, no electricity, and almost live like something you've never seen before. The same thing is true in Flint. And the question is, what's going to happen to these people? My research is bringing me to a point to wonder if we're not dealing with a social Darwinism. And in other words, it's not just if you're poor in a single-headed household, that if you're elderly, you can't pay your taxes. We're having a large amount of poverty and crime. We keep acting like, what are you going to do about crime? Well, I hear the talk, and I did see 60 Minutes, and I'm not knocking downtown Detroit, although I will say that why I applaud it, and I do seriously. I'm beginning to wonder if downtown Detroit is not Emerald City, that it is based on both race and class. It's hard to separate them. There's also, and I have quite a few and my students here, it is geared towards young people. That's what it's about. It has private transportation. And I would tell Professor Darden in particular that downtown Detroit is beginning to look like, and is that what we want? A little old Manhattan. If I'm stepping on toes in New York, I apologize. But the fact is, when I say little Manhattan, that's where the money is. You might be able to work in Manhattan as a working class person, but you certainly will not be able to live in Manhattan. We look at the fact that, in our research, we're looking at the fact that you have over 300 independent governments in the greater Detroit area. You wonder where your tax dollars are going. But last, I would say that we're going to unleash our unholy military police in the neighborhoods to clean it up. That is the term that would be used. That is the same old song that has been played for the last half century. That song may look good to those who are privileged, but eventually that will wear off, and we'll be back in the same place that we have been over the last half century. If you think your prisons are working, then I applaud you. I will tell you that is the most expensive tuition in the state of Michigan. It's not the University of Michigan. It's not Spartan tuition. It's the tuition that has dissolved. We don't have juveniles anymore. This state is now being sued because we place children into big prisons. You may say, so be it. I would tell you we do not have enough money to solve this. The last thing I have to tell you that there's a strong segment that is the parallel to what I talk about, underground, which is just poor people. They haven't broken the law unless poverty is breaking the law. But we have a very strong underworld. Some of it organized, some of it's not. When the plants were hiring and doing well, we had a tremendous recreational drug population in this nation. Many of my students enjoy smoking those trees. But it's beyond smoking trees. It's heroin, it's other drugs that we as Americans, kid yourself for one moment. The billion-dollar illicit narcotics commerce is not carried on the back of a poor community. Detroit is the poorest it's the poorest big city. It's the blackest big city. You can kid yourself all day. What I did is sit down, we copied license plates. We weren't supposed to do that, but we did. And we found out that most of our drug consumers that were coming repeatedly were not from the hood. Oh yeah, we have plenty of folks there. But where they really were coming from in massive numbers were from suburbia. They were very much a part of that consumption. So the picture that I paint is the ugly one, but I would say do not kill the messenger. I'll tell you very strongly that young men look more favorable to becoming part of the drug world or other things. And the violence is measured by, and I will close, the violence is measured by something that sticks in the craw here at our university. A few years back, we had one of our great All-Americans, Plaxico Burgess, was here. He went into the pros and made quite a name for himself. As a matter of fact, he was MVP in the Super Bowl. About a few months later, he was in New York, and he happened to let his glove fall down his pants, and he shot himself. Should he have been punished because New York has a strict law about guns? Absolutely, he should have been punished. But should he become a criminal, removed from the street, placed into prison for 2 years? I question it. I understand that the mayor was leading the charge on that. But when I speak to young African-American males about a system that some say is not out to get them, the paranoia is really not paranoia, is it? We define paranoia as something that doesn't exist. This does exist. While he went to prison for 2 years, 2 years out of his career, then I have to turn around and explain to young men why young African-American men are not a species being hunted, like what happened to Trayvon Martin. You have to look at those facts, and I guess I will continue.
Stephanie, will you come in and make sure your mic is working? And definitely we will come back to that point later. It also ties into a question I'm going to prompt you with about rehabilitation. Keep that in your mind, rehabilitation. Dr. Joe Darden is professor in the Department of Geography and former Dean of Urban Affairs Programs, and that's actually how I got to know Joe, so I'm actually going to tell a little story on him. When I started out as a young assistant professor, and he talked with me about what it takes to get tenure. And his directive to me was that I had to not submit, but I had to publish 3 peer-reviewed articles in the top journal in my field every single year. And I sat there and looked at him and I was like, yeah, okay, I'm not talking to him anymore. But just this idea that we really do have to strive for excellence. And we can't just think that we're going to get it if we are good at what we do. We have to be more than good at what we do. We have to actually push the boundaries. And so I think that's important when you think about the history of his work that he's done in Detroit. He received the Distinguished Faculty Award in 1984, and Dr. Darden's research interests are urban social geography, residential segregation, immigration, and socioeconomic neighborhood inequality in multiracial societies. He is the author or co-author of 7 books, several of them with faculty who were here at MSU and have now gone on to other institutions and or retired, so a long history of work in Detroit. With John Frazier and Noah Henry, Dr. Darden co-authored The African Diaspora in the United States and Canada at the Dawn of the 21st Century. This year, Dr. Darden joined historian Richard Thomas to co-author the book Detroit, Race Riots, Racial Conflicts, and Efforts to Bridge the Racial Divide, of which he will talk about today, and hopefully when we get into the open forum, you'll also be able to probe him more about the role he played as both a faculty member and an administrator in ensuring that faculty on this campus paid attention to the concerns of urban communities, Detroit and otherwise. Joe?
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right, I guess you can. Okay. I really appreciate you coming out. I see some of my students here. I'm always pleased when students are so intellectually interested. Is it okay now? Should I stand up? Use this one? This one? Oh, okay. Sure.
I think we need a refund on our technology.
Is this one okay now? Let me try in the next few minutes to put what I'm about to say in perspective. What I will do is essentially explain why metropolitan Detroit is the most racially segregated and class segregated metropolitan area in the United States. The question always comes up, why is that? And so I want to answer that question. Secondly, I want to explain the history of metropolitan Detroit within the context of struggle. Struggle between the majority group and the minority group, especially blacks, and also Mexican Americans, along with Asians to a certain extent, and you'll understand why as I talk about that group, and to a large extent also the Arab population in Detroit. But the conflict that has been most revealed has been the continuous struggle for equal opportunity on the part of the black population in metropolitan Detroit, and the resistance to that equal opportunity on the part of the majority white population over the whole history of the area. And the struggle has been primarily in the area of education, whereby black students were trying to get an equal education that was not separate and unequal, and in areas of unemployment, where the black workers were trying to get a job that would pay them a decent wage, and they were resistant in terms of accomplishing that. And the last one is the resistance on the part of the police force, leading to police brutality and the fact that blacks were treated differentially throughout that whole history. So this is the racial conflict, but let me give all due to my co-author, Richard Thomas, who would like to say And Joe, you have to also talk about the history of those efforts to bring that racial divide. And so I'm indicating to this book that we've just done talks about that history, but it also talks about those blacks and whites and others who worked together, the free whites working together to bring about the racial unity in metropolitan Detroit, even though what they did not succeed because they could not counter the continuous disinvestment in the city of Detroit and the continuous segregation in terms of public education. So let me go back to 1950 because this is the point when Detroit was at its peak. It was a city in which people throughout the United States wanted to come and live in. It was the place to be. At that time, Detroit was 16% black. Investment was at its peak. People could get jobs. It was a place to really celebrate. After 1950, the investors started to disinvest in Detroit and invest instead outside the boundaries of the city, that is in the suburbs. As the investment started to occur in the suburbs and disinvestment in the city, the economic status of the city started to decline. The white population went to where the opportunities were. In other words, they left the city of Detroit. They've been leaving since 1950. So understand what is happening in terms of population decline started in 1950. Many, many whites left in 1950 as the opportunities existed outside. Blacks too wanted to leave, but they were prevented from leaving through racial discrimination in housing. Blacks could only get to the boundary of 8 Mile and they could not go across. So very few blacks were able to live in the suburbs prior to the 1968 Fair Housing Act because the real estate brokers, apartment managers, banks and so forth did not allow it. So you had a situation that was evolving that would create eventually a demographic imbalance, whereas whites would be living outside the city where the opportunities were, and blacks would be trapped in the city of Detroit where the opportunities were few. And this would apply to employment because most of the jobs were leaving the city of Detroit, moving to the suburbs. Blacks could not follow those jobs where they were not allowed to do so. And so what happened, the black protests started to occur after the 1943 riots all the way up to 1967. And blacks, remembering what Martin Luther King said, inaction to peaceful protests make violent protests inevitable. So indeed, violent protests occurred in 1967 when Detroit, along with 100 other cities in the United States, started to riot. This book that we have here picks the story up at that point and then moves forward to ask the question, did things improve after the riots of 1967? Or did things get worse? And if they did, what would be the future for the people of Detroit? That's what we try to answer. And when I finish with this, I want you to critique me in terms of the alternative solution that Richard Thomas and I have presented. I'm always interested in people giving me an alternative perspective. Say, look, Darden, that is not something that's going to work. I want to hear that. Or you can say, Darden, I think it will work. I like to hear that too. So what we've argued then is that there was no hope in the city of Detroit for blacks to get an equal education. And this was sealed after 1974 when the Milliken versus Bradley U.S. Supreme Court case ruled against 9-year-old Bradley and told him he could not leave the city of Detroit for an education, even though the schools were not equal as the schools in the suburbs. That's what that Milliken versus Bradley decision did. It locked those blacks in a situation where they would always be separate and unequal when it came to education. And that situation continued to get worse over time. In fact, we've examined the situation where when blacks start entering schools in Detroit, the gap between blacks and whites is not as wide. But each grade level, as they stay in the school system, the gap gets wider. By the time they begin high school, the gap is so wide that it could not be closed. So that would not be any hope. In terms of jobs, there's no hope in terms of equal opportunity for employment as long as you have the situation of spatial mismatch, where blacks are living in the city, the jobs in the suburbs. So in terms of opportunity then, one has to look around at this landscape, which is a landscape in the metro area that's uneven. Opportunities are unevenly distributed. Most of the opportunities exist outside of the city. Yet you have a disproportionate black population that's poor in the city itself. The question becomes, what can that population do to improve itself, to bring itself up to a level where it can be equal, at least in part, to the populations living outside. The question then becomes, what decision can the population itself make? And in terms of decisions that have been made up to that point, decisions were made by somebody else. Investors made decisions, jobs may be created, jobs may not. The school boards made decisions, you may go to the school or you may not. But the government will make a decision, I'll give you an emergency manager. So in a sense, what has happened is, few decisions are being made by the people themselves. So the question that we raise is what? What decision can the household itself make to improve their lives? In the last chapter of the book, it talks about an alternative solution for the population of Detroit. It is a solution that comes out of my training as a geographer that says, place of residence matter. Where you live impacts your life chances, your quality of life, your education, your health, your job opportunities. All of those things are based in large part on where you live. So if the population of Detroit is to get anywhere near equality, that population has to move to those areas where opportunities exist. And so I've advocated in the last chapter that as long as the population exists in the context of this demographic imbalance, blacks will always be separate and unequal. And so what they have to do then is to look around for where the opportunities are. If there's a black parent, they have to raise the question this: where are the high achieving schools in the metropolitan area? And then they have to move to the neighborhood where those schools are. That is the way to do it. Or look around and say, where are the job opportunities? And you have to move to the neighborhood where the jobs are plentiful. As long as you exist in a place that is not equal in terms of education, or a place that is not equal in terms of jobs, inequality by race will continue to exist. So the argument is a spatial mobility approach. Move to opportunity. That would be the remedy, as I see it. That would also provide a remedy in terms of public safety, because it is a risk to live where you are in many of those neighborhoods. It is also very expensive. Some people think it's not expensive to live. It is very expensive to live in Detroit. Your auto insurance, for example, will probably be 3 times as high. Your property taxes will be high. Your property insurance is going to be high. It is not inexpensive to live in the city. What we've done in the book is to also examine the question of affordability, because the minute we recommend the spatial mobility solution, they say, well, what? Who can afford it? We've looked at what rent is being paid already, and then look around the metropolitan areas and look for the same rent. These are places you can live. You have to then make that decision whether you want to stay where you are, and if you're happy where you are, stay there. But if you're not happy where you are, these are opportunities you can emphasize and move. So the solution here, as we see it, is to move to opportunity. That's what I want you to assess, that Darden, it will work or it will not work.
Thank you, Joe. And if any political economists are hanging out there, this might sound like vote with your feet, Tebow's motto, and so feel free to take up that point. Next, we have Dr. Zenia Kotval, who is a professor and program leader in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction. Dr. Kotval is the director of the MSU Extension Urban Collaborators and Urban Planning Partnerships. Her scholarship interests are in community-based development, economic policy and planning, the changing structure and characteristics of local economies, and the impacts of community development strategies. With a strong structured research, teaching, and engagement agenda, she focuses on linking theory and practice with a special emphasis on local economic development, industrial restructuring, and urban revitalization. And anyone that studies cities knows that you can't really do an effective job at scholarship in cities if you don't somehow engage in what's actually happening in cities. And so Dr. Kotval is on the ground, understanding what's happening in different communities, and is going to share her perspective on Detroit today.
Thank you very much. I know it's really hard for you guys to tell that I am not a native Detroiter, either by looking at me or from my accent, but you know, that goes with the territory. I am an urban planner, and as an urban planner, we tend to be optimistic. We tend to look at the brighter side. We tend to look at what can happen. We tend to look at the future and what we can do to make places better. So what do urban planners do? We usually look at an area from an environmental scan, i.e. everything from data bits, what's happening in the community, what are the current conditions. We engage the public, the people that actually live there, to come up with solutions. We like to say we build on assets. We like to say that we don't necessarily only dwell on the negatives, because there's plenty of those running around. Pick up a newspaper, see the media. We think about future. We plan for the future. Create goals and objectives, identify strategies that we can use, come up with implementation plans, and then reevaluate and see what we've done and come up with. Now, I have to say that my research focus is not Detroit. However, I have looked at enough urban places in my life to know similarities. And since Detroit wasn't my focus, what did I do first? I went in and I looked at what's happening in Detroit from a data perspective. And Detroit Growth Coalition has just finished its Detroit Future Cities Framework Plan. We actually have the author of that plan, one of the chief authors of that plan in our audience, Tony Griffin, this afternoon. And I looked at that and pulled out 6 slides that talk about data. And I'm really going to go through this relatively quickly. So, Detroit is international. Each day, there is 1.7 billion in goods going across the Ambassador Bridge. That happens to be 25% of all US-Canadian trade in a year. Okay. So, we have an international presence. Detroit is regional. Southwest Detroit has 4.7 million in population. Out of that, 700,000 live in Detroit. It is estimated that 300,000 jobs are going to be created in Southwest Michigan over the next 40 years. Okay. Out of that, only 2% are projected to be in Detroit. So, Detroit is regional, plays a great role in terms of what is regional, how it can behave regionally. The city itself, $4.22 million have been invested in the city since 2008 by foundations. 19 million, I can't read these myself, but Detroit is, let me go back and say, Detroit is the 18th largest city today, based on 2010 population. It used to be the 4th largest city in 1940. Population has dropped by over 60% between 1950 and 2010. Some statistics on employment. If you can see, 61% of people in Detroit work outside the city limits, right? 61% work outside. Contrast that with the fact that 70% of jobs in Detroit are taken by people outside of Detroit. So you see the mismatch? 60% goes out, 70% from the outside comes in. 21% in that figure is the amount of people in Detroit that actually have access to personal vehicles. Mobility is a problem. Education and employment. Again, out of 300,000 jobs projected for Southeast Michigan, only 2% are going to go to Detroit. 20% of Detroiters live in poverty. 68% of Detroiters live in poverty. 20% of those actually have a high school education and above. They're still living in poverty. Detroit has 27 jobs available per 100 residents. That's beyond the fact that 70% of the people come in from outside. Race and ethnicity issues, same thing. Only 15% of the employers are African American, and they create only 12% of the annual revenue from businesses. So yes, it is a rather racial divide. Population, again, 61% drop in population. If you 80,000 units of empty housing, 22% of industrial land in Detroit is vacant. Detroit has 20 square miles of vacant land area. 20 square miles. Just to put that into perspective, Manhattan is 23 square miles and 1.6 million in population. So the size of Manhattan is vacant area, dispersed, but vacant area in Detroit. Some other numbers. 40% of the public transportation is subsidized. Buses are running at 75% capacity at peak hours. Only 40% of the lights, street lights, 35,000 street lights, are in working condition. In terms of water, the water is being used at 40% capacity. There is 42 billion gallons of water that are wasted or unaccounted for. That is equal to 4,800 swimming pools. So this is some of the data, and planners look at data and go beyond that and say, okay, so what do we do? So the data tells a story. If you look at the media and you look at the press tells a story. And we see from photographs, we see from pictures. These are the glory days. Okay? And I'm saying, is this the same Detroit? The first picture shows you when Detroit announced bankruptcy. That was the picture flashed in the newspaper. Picture next to that is the United Artists Theater. 2 industrial neighborhoods. This is what we're seeing in the press. Is this the same Detroit? Regardless of the downturn, regardless of all of those bad pictures, you can see that there is life. There's people. People are trying to make the best of what they have and what they can. So there is hope. There's hope, and there is a way that people, if they work together under a framework, could possibly come back. Again, see all the people involved. Does this look like a dead city to you? Doesn't to me. This is architecture in Detroit. So, what do planners do? Evidence-based approach. 1, we try to start with the basics. Detroit is going to be smaller. It can be a better city with a smaller population. We're never going to go back to the 1.8 million in population that we had before. We're going to be smaller. We need better regional transportation networks, which you can see from the fact that people are moving in and out of the city just for jobs. We need a smaller, diversified economy. We know what happened with the top 3 with the automobile industry. We need to better utilize and coordinate land and infrastructure. We have a lot of vacant land and infrastructure. We have a 61% drop in top property tax revenue. We have 60% less in population, yet we are trying to manage the same amount of infrastructure with so much vacant land in the same amount of time. Leadership is one of the prime things that comes to play. We need strong leadership, leadership from the ground up. Much like Joe said, the people need to get involved in this. People need to get involved in making these decisions. Civic engagement and capacity building is a major theme. Partnering with people that have money, influence, vision is important. Regulatory reforms, and all of that is going to take time and patience. So my question to you is, what do we choose to do? What do we choose to see? Our newspaper articles, everything that we are looking at, everything that everyone's talking about Detroit is Detroit, emergency, bankrupt, bailout, shrinking, bad. Or do we see things such as what's framed in the new plan, Detroit Futures, which is ideas, vision, future, hope. And I'm hoping that you guys, as the future generations, will see a brighter side of Detroit than what we're all seeing in the newspapers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Zenia. Thank you to our entire panel, and I have to thank them for making my job of keeping time easy. And part of why we try to restrict their time is so that we can open the floor to you. We know that you've come with questions or comments yourself, and we want you to engage with the panel. I'm going to invite my colleague John to come snag a mic, and maybe if he takes it far enough away, it won't reverberate. And again, going to prompt you with, if you don't have questions, we always do, but we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to engage. Our panelists don't hold back. They are ready. We had a meeting a couple weeks ago where we got We got to talk about what everybody was doing, and I can tell you this is just the tip of the iceberg. Literally, each one of them could go for an hour themselves, and would be thoroughly engaging, and you'd have tons of questions. So we'll just see where it goes. And please do raise your hand if you have a question, and Jenny will come meet you with the mic.
Okay, first I'm going to do a quick commercial. Currently at the MSU Museum, we have an exhibit called Detroit Resurgent. It's going to be going on until the middle of January. And that exhibit looks at the revival of the city of Detroit through its people. 36 out of 62 portraits that were done of different people involved with the revival of the city of Detroit. So I invite you all to come see it at the museum, and the book comes out on MSU Press in April. So Julie can tell you all about that in the back. So I think we need to hold these mics as far away from ourselves as we can. And I saw a hand right over here.
Hello, over there. Here we go. It's not really a question, but for our urban planner. Detroit and Flint and Saginaw seem to have a very particular history that, especially the highways and the construction, targeted the black community almost. It was almost like a bombing raid. To a certain extent, Lansing, but it wasn't as big of a city, so it didn't feel as bad. Have you ever seen that type of thing in a region around the world? You sound like you've been around a bit. That like the whole eastern side of the state was just, where were the urban planners when we needed them? I guess is my question. Have you ever seen that type of situation?
Well, we did have the phenomenon of the urban bulldozer going through many a good city. Jane Jacob talks about how wonderful cities and neighborhoods have been torn by highways and highway building. So Detroit is not necessarily unique in that. Perhaps Detroit has a really bigger problem than many of the other places. But if you look at the whole highway in Boston that was put underground, the Seaport District in Boston was pretty much a lost area, a lot of vacant land, a lot of bad buildings. They put that whole highway underground, and you should look at it now. It's thriving. But even in other countries, Germany is going through shrinking cities. There are places in Italy that have gone through the same decline and highway building institutions. So there are issues, and Detroit does have it bad. But on the other hand, we can change that.
Well, I just wanted to address that. One of the things that affected the music scene in Detroit was the urban planning plan in 1958. When they came in, they decided to build 475 downtown, and that replaced Hastings Street. And historically, Hastings Street was the street in Detroit where all the jazz clubs and rhythm and blues clubs were. And that district was never replaced with anything else. And so that was one of the points in Detroit where many of the musicians began to leave, because they went to cities where there were opportunities, primarily places like Los Angeles and places like New York City. And that was largely, some of the musicians that I grew up with under, who were my mentors, like Earl Van Dyke, Herbie Williams, people like Donald Walden, folks like that, they described a scene that the saving grace for them was the fact that Motown Studios opened up. And when they came, there were no gigs. You took the whole street where all the clubs were, and they were gone. And then nothing ever replaced it.
It's just a comment. Every city has areas in their city that need to be revitalized and improved. I'm not from Detroit, but because Detroit is a bigger city, obviously it's going to draw more attention. Just like we play in sports, if you're a little guy, you won't get it.
I have to tell you, my background is I'm the director of the statewide nonprofit for historic preservation, doing a lot of work in the city of Detroit. So my question to the panel is, there's a lot of talk about demolition. The mayor has stated that he would like 10,000 structures demolished before the end of his term, and now Mr. Gilbert is talking about over 70,000. There seems to be not a great plan for this demolition. We're grateful to Detroit Future City, but how do you think that those numbers impact not only the layout of the city, but the people that live there?
Whenever there are these plans to demolish or get rid of homes and so forth, what you have to do is keep your eye on whether or not the common people are given or an opportunity to improve themselves in terms of better housing, even though it may not be there. But if they're impacted in some way, that is, they have fewer units after this happens, then that's a negative. If they have more units after it happens, that's a positive. The key is to look at the common people themselves and then make that decision as to whether it's a good thing or bad. Not necessarily at those who buy the property, but the people who live there and whether their lives are improved. That's the best indicator as to what is the best thing to do.
Detroit is also a shrinking city in the sense that we're never going to need all the houses that we have there. 80,000 of those are vacant right now. So some demolition is going to happen. Some of the streets are not being used. Some of those need to be only emergency repairs or something of that sort. We can't have the same infrastructure base and the same amount of homes and housing and base without having that kind of population. So while the numbers that you're talking about are really drastic, I don't think Detroit Future suggests that kind of demolition. But some of it is going to happen. It's just, there's too much infrastructure, too much space for the amount of people that are currently living in the city.
Question over on this side. Question? Okay, I'm coming.
So it seems that the biggest idea, and I guess what you would call new urbanism, is that healthy cities really depend on density or the availability of public transit in such a way that not every single person has to drive a car to everywhere they go or use a bus system that is just a travesty, honestly. And I guess I just wonder, along with that density comes the idea that Detroit has to become a lot more, centered around the downtown area, which is where you see development happening. But I guess that leaves, what happens to the rest of the city when that happens? I mean, Detroit is such a huge area. How do you reconcile all of this free extra land? I mean, what do you do with it? When people talk about a smaller, healthier city, that doesn't only mean population, but does that also mean spatially, just as far as the land that the city governs? I mean, do you have any thoughts on what happens to that empty land as we go forward if we're talking about a denser city centered around downtown? And I mean, I remember somebody mentioned that it's like Manhattan, that people can't afford to live in downtown, but if you're going to have a denser city that's healthier, what happens? I guess is my question. That's several questions, but...
You want me to answer? I think what is taking place is that I believe strongly that it is being ignored. There is a loss of humanity. I think that while I applaud downtown development, and it is small, the city's going to be smaller, but you pointed out something very good. Transportation has been a joke for some time. And we don't like to point to the fact that General Motors and others were very much part of this development of the superhighways and that took people outside of the city. We haven't had good, solid public transportation in Detroit for some time. So wherever you lived, you either got on the highway, there was not solid, consistent bus system. Whereas when I was a young guy coming up in Detroit, there was a solid bus system, so much so that you could catch the bus and you didn't have to worry about your watch because it ran every 15 minutes very well. That's all gone. So now we flip-flop back and forth. But the other thing is that I keep hearing, I'm saying, Rodney, I don't think everything is innocent and as pure, what the people are saying. That you went through Black Bottom. It wasn't simply that the musicians and the musician clubs, you had an entire community with entrepreneurship that had stores and was very viable. And you just, oops, you ran through that and just, oops, it's gone again. So you put yourself in a position that what matters the most, all this clearing out, banging up homes that had a lot of history to them, we just, oops, we moved that out of the way, and in return, what's coming, I'm sorry, I can't stand here and be part of the hypocrisy. What is coming is just business. That's all this is. This is free market, and what counts is business. And what counts the most is dollars. And so that's what's taking place. The mid-city is great, but we haven't had street lights for years. We haven't had the water. So those individuals will be left there to fend for themselves, or they will be subsidized by some bootleg electricity and other things going on that is not going to be a quality of life, just like the schools. I'm sorry, the schools do not have the same footing that they did 30 years ago. So that's why I frown upon it. And I think it's, with all due respect to everyone, it's very complex. I don't think it's as simple. We tear down these houses and everybody lives happily ever after. Not happening.
Can I say one thing to that? Some years ago, I was looking at moving to Chicago, and I was involved, I was working, this was probably 20 years ago, working with Columbia College. And at that particular time, the Bulls were building their new stadium. And Michael Jordan actually got involved in it because the idea was to move all of the African-American residents off of the West Side to put the stadium. And where they would move, no one cared. So Michael Jordan got involved in this and said, look, we have to do something. This is a humane, we have to do something humane. We have to provide housing. So one of the great things, and Chicago has since done this really well all over the city, is that the compromise was to build high-priced condos mixed in with subsidized housing. And it was, so many of the folks that probably wouldn't have been able to stay in that community were now able to stay in that community. And some of the schools in that area was improved because you had folks coming in who had more economics, so it provided a tax base for that particular community, while the concept that all boats float with the tide. And I think that when I look at Detroit, I think about solutions like that. Now, I'm not, because this city is what I'm about. It made me who I am. And I could be the mayor, my wife will let me run. But it's really about creating opportunity. I agree with her 100%. It's a city full of opportunity, but you have to come with some ideas. I don't believe that moving out is 100% the key.
Well, that's good, because what I always say is that if you're happy where you are, then stay there. If you have the best education where you are, stay there. If the jobs are where you are, stay there. There are all kinds of reasons. If you have it, stay there. So it's not going to fit everybody, because some people have jobs. Some people, I guess, are sending their kids to the high-achieving school, and they're happy. And I suggest staying there. What I'm talking about are solutions to the people who don't have that. They don't have their kids going to the high-achieving schools. They don't have the jobs available to them. They don't have the public safety that they want. So they're not satisfied. And if you're not satisfied, you have to have some solutions. And I'm offering them a solution, is what I'm doing. They can take it or leave it.
Just on the healthy cities part and density, healthy cities is not only about densities, it's about green infrastructure. Detroit has an antiquated and way outdated sewage system plant. The road, they put crack back into the river at least 3 or 4 times a year because they can't deal with it. So green infrastructure would be one way to go. Food security is another huge thing in Detroit. You must have heard about all the urban agriculture themes that are going around. Not that that is the say-all and end-all of it, but food, good food, decent food in Detroit is an important issue. That's an issue that would fall under healthy cities. Parks and open space. Detroit does not have enough parks and open space for its diminished current population. So more green areas, more park space, things such as that would definitely make a difference. And then a lot of places where the population has shrunk and it's not going back goes into renaturalization or reforestation. That's something that Detroit could think about as well, making it a greener area, not just building in, not just building up density. So.
Let me just sort of say one thing real quickly, and I'll leave it. I'll let somebody else talk. Let me say this again. You will notice a slight difference, I think, in terms of what I'm suggesting and what you're suggesting. You're suggesting the thing of beauty. I'm suggesting the basics, a job, the best education you can get. Those are the things I'm talking about first. Once you satisfy those things, then we can talk about beauty.
Here's the danger with one mic.
I want to ask this question of Joe Darden. There seems to be some problems with your solution, and I want to name them and have you respond to them so we understand your thinking a little bit more fully. It seems to me that your solution takes the metropolitan area as it is and accepts it. Accepts it as an unequal place of public services, public opportunities, and it just says move the people, kind of exodus strategy, libertarian strategy, move the people to where there's opportunity. That seems to me to neglect 2 things. This is what I want you to respond to. Number one, all the things that Carl Taylor and Rodney talked about were based on agglomeration economies. There couldn't have been a Cass Tech great music program unless there were a significant population that produced honor students that could support the existence of a Cass Tech. There couldn't have been good things for people growing up in Detroit unless there were communities of the strength that Carl Taylor mentioned that policed his behavior in his teenage years. It seems to me your solution walks away from that. And it says that they can't be rebuilt, they can't exist again, and we wash our hands of that. That's one concern I have. The other concern I have is the notion that proximity is the same as a solution. People can move to better areas where there are more opportunities, there are better schools, but that doesn't mean that they're going to get the jobs in those areas simply because they live nearby. Nor does going to a good school produce the same kind of equality. There can be inequality inside good schools. So I'd like you to elaborate your thinking a little bit further to talk about those kinds of things.
I'll do that. You will notice that when both Carl and Professor Whitaker mentioned what they mentioned, they put their comments in a temporal perspective, a time perspective. They said back when I was going to school, the situation was different then. That situation has deteriorated substantially since the time they went to school. The schools are much, much worse today than they were then. And so they got progressively worse over time. The job prospect was better then than they are now. So what has happened is there's been a decline in terms of opportunity within the city of Detroit. And that opportunity now does not offer what it offered when they were going to school. And so what we have to look at now is, what does the future hold? It may not be where you are. And this business about rebuilding, history has taught me, through the research I've done, going back in history, there were all kinds of efforts to improve the situation. And almost everything they did failed. Why? Because there were always a counter group that opposed what they were doing. In terms of a good education, they opposed what they were doing. In terms of jobs, housing, they opposed it. So in a sense, they were fighting a losing battle. And I essentially commend those nonprofit organizations who worked hard all the time to bring about more opportunity, equality for everybody. But they could not counter those investors and others who opposed equal opportunity for those people who wanted it. And so what I'm saying now, given that, and given the history of failure, I'm offering a new alternative here. I would say, let's try something else now. Let us try a situation where these individuals will be given an opportunity to go to the high achieving school. There's research that very clearly establishes that if you're inside a high achieving school, even though you yourself may be poor, you will get a better education than if you're in a school that is not a high achieving school. That evidence is very clear. So I oppose the idea that if you just are in the school, that you won't get a good education. That is not the case in terms of most of the research on schools, in terms of offering an opportunity for good education. Did I answer all your questions?
Okay. I have three things I'd like to you guys to talk about a little. Number one, as a public school teacher for many years, I'm worried about music and art being done away with to have better test scores. I'm very concerned about that. Number two is I'm concerned about felons. As far as once you are a felon, you are no longer able to do much of anything in our society. And what can we do to change that? Because once a felon, you're kind of screwed the rest of your life, even if you're a felon at 19. And thirdly, I'm from Chicago, and I believe Mayor Daley first did a great thing for our city when he said if you were a fireman, a policeman, or a teacher, you had to live within the city limits. And from my perspective, that kept a thriving middle class in the city. So if you would comment on any of those three.
Thank you. Very good questions. One, Detroit has had a historical problem with the unions, the police and the fire union, about being able to live where they want outside. So that bridge, unless they rebuild it, is gone. They don't, and I agree with you 100%. The quality of life is not the same in Detroit. And I think you make an excellent point. We have so many ex-felons. Wayne County, where Detroit is, we have more young men and women, but mainly young men, who have been incarcerated than anybody in the whole entire state. So we have not done, as Joe has pointed out, and I think, well, there's been a lot of great attempts to help them re-enter. But honestly, we're having a difficult time even getting folks who don't have criminal records jobs. And so it becomes a competitive thing that really is just a fallacy. And the problem with that, and I take very strong stand here, is that once they are frustrated and they see what is taking place, they go back and do what they know best. The one institution that is there with them is the crime institution. And so that quality of life is really bad. And it's been normalized. And so I wish I could say more, but we're not giving jobs to ex-felons. And we're in the same thing, we shut them off inside the penal institutions. They can no longer get college education or whatever, unless somebody pays for it. And so they're down to the bare minimum. They're stockpiling them. I think they come out very angry. And then the last thing that we don't talk about is mental health. Mental health is a big issue. We have a lot of people, including a lot of veterans, guys who have paid their debt to society, fought for this nation, and they're walking the streets in Flint, Detroit, and so forth, without medication and so forth. So, and many of those young men will end up in prison because we have no place else for them to go. This is not going away. And so when you look at the quality of life that we're talking about in the city, and the number one issue, I think, before you can have jobs or good schools, is you have to have public safety. You have college, and those of you, we had an 83-year-old woman about a month ago that was in Detroit, who was a teacher. They broke into her house. She was a teacher. She was diminutive. She was 5 feet tall. She gave her life to education. The young men, I'm being nice to call them young men, they came in there. The lady downstairs is 89 years old. They beat her unmerciful and so forth. And everybody, they look at me, well, there you go, Taylor, pull an alarm. And that's an incident in the newspaper. Well, damn that. If you had someone 83 years old in this community, in Ann Arbor, or any other place, we would be in damn rage. We would have moral outrage that would be absolutely unbelievable. So we just asked Detroit, that's what goes on. So I go back and forth with Joe on this, but I think he has a point, because you're not going back to the community that I came up in. I slept on the porch when I was a kid, because we weren't worried about anybody coming on our porch. Public safety has to come first. Before you can be employed, you go to the gas station. Do you know that Detroit does not have one damn gas station where you can go to the bathroom? You get older like me, you stop coming flying in from Lansing, I gotta go to the bathroom. I can't go to the bathroom. I'm serious. It seems simple, but I can't go to the bathroom. I can't walk up to fast food. This is a reality that people live with every day. And so we got a new cop, and he makes a lot of money. Yeah, I'm very much into self-policing, so it's very tough. I really commend you for your question, but you can see I'm wrapped up in this. This is beyond what we're talking about. This is not going to go away. And where are these people going? That's the problem. They have no jobs. We talk, just the one thing you talked about is felons. We got so many damn felons, it's not even a little bit funny. Where are they going? Nobody's going to beam them up. Sorry.
That's all right.
Well, there's a couple things you have mentioned in music, but there's one thing I would like to say before I talk about the music. You know, I go back to thinking, you know, sometimes I shake my head being an American, because we just spent $16 trillion fighting the war on terror. And all of the cities have fallen apart, crumbling all over the United States. I mean, can you imagine you driving on I-94 in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it collapsed? Because we spent $16 trillion fighting a war rather than rebuilding our nation. And so as I sit here and look at all the money that we wasted on wars, and I think about Detroit, what if we would have just put maybe like $500 million into Detroit? What the city would be like. But I'll get off my soapbox. I'm going to move on to the music part. That's what I'm expert on. So, a couple years ago, we had the person who came in, who took over the school board, and was appointed by the governor to decide a few things. And one of the things that they decided was that they should cut music out of Detroit public schools. And there was such outrage from the community. They had pink slipped all the music teachers, and they had to apply for their job. And so they were basically going to cut them all out, and the community was in outrage, and they reinstated most of the teachers. And I think that part of it was a person who was from outside of the community that merely just looked at numbers and wasn't really aware of the musical legacy of a city like Detroit. Regardless of how bad the school system are, we're still producing some of the best musicians on earth. I don't know how that happens. Every year I'm meeting some new young kid that's a jazz musician that's growing up in the worst school in Detroit. But they're committed to the legacy of being a great musician. I don't know how that happens. But I think part of it too, is we have to do a better job. And I got to go back to this as a nation, letting people know the importance of the arts. It goes back to the arts. And here's the other thing. You know that every kid I played in the band with was an honor student. I got straight A's all from K through 12th grade because I played music. And the statistics show that musicians have high IQs and do better at school than most people. Right? We have great math skills. We have to learn how to subdivide. I knew how to do fractions before I knew it was a fraction. Right? I played 3/4 time. I had to subdivide the time. 3 beats per measure. I looked at that fraction. Get 4 beats. A quarter note gets a beat. So I also learned how to speak Italian before I knew it was another language. So I got language skills being a musician. Vivace, allegro, those are all Italian terms, all the terms in our music. I learned how to multi-language. I mean, come on. That's what you do as a musician, right? And musicians are smart. You can't be a musician. Charlie Parker was the most intelligent person to live. So I think that as a nation, we have to rethink what we think about arts and music.
I have to say, though, I think art is very important even when you're not a musician. I thank God for the exposure that I had to art and music, and I had no hopes of being a musician or an artist per se. Children, young people need to be exposed to art.
And in Detroit, every
all
kid
kind of
is
music.
art.
Yes, that's what I think is bad.
And we're going to bring Joe up in a minute. I want to share with you a study that was done here at Michigan State University on Honors College alums and then also faculty in engineering showed that the most creative and innovative people had an arts background. So people who have been in arts throughout their career. And Joe wanted to weigh in, and then we have a question from the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention to you about the history of the police in Detroit not living in the city. There was a time when they had to live in the city in order to be effective police officers. So it's community policing. When Coleman Young became mayor, he wanted them to stay in the city of Detroit because he thought it would be a very good thing to do. The police force in Detroit has been disproportionately white for a long time, and he was trying to use affirmative action to get it changed. However, since most of those white police officers did not want to live in the city, and the mayor said you must live here, the police officer went to the state legislature and told them to pass a special bill to give us the right not to live in the city of Detroit. And the legislature did that. So then they moved outside the city of Detroit. So they became less effective as police officers when they did that, because they would then engage in police brutality or in excess of what they had done before.
Given that Rodney's wife won't let him be mayor, where do you see the future leadership coming from in Detroit? Right now, we see, as you talked about, outsiders, or the school board, outsiders being imposed upon Detroit. And where are the future leaders going to come from to deal with all the things you've talked about here? Do you see any way of leadership developing from within?
That's a very good question. Maybe the two Detroiters should answer that question.
Thanks, Joe. It's an excellent question, very tough. I think that there are young people there that can be bred for leadership. And I have some students even in the university. I think that I'm careful there because it can come from anywhere within our community. It really could. But right now, politics in Detroit is at its very worst, I think, with an emergency manager and the corruption that we just went through. Let's not sit here and pretend that the world didn't notice that. So it's tough to develop leadership when I think some kids look away, and I hate to say this, but I think when Joe's talking about, I think in many neighborhoods, things are so bad that they just can't wait to get the hell out, and you couldn't blame them. So I think if we had a few wins, some young people would develop, and there's a lot of leadership development going on, that's not to say, but I think every time we put a nail in the coffin, a lot of young people just, they think they're coming back, but the grass is greener someplace else, and what do you have in the city?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, I look at it, and the thing that I think about all the great cities that I've traveled to and spent time in the world is that you have folks who know how to mend, leadership that knows how to mend the fences. I mean, you can't rebuild a city like Detroit without all the money that's above 8 Mile. And so you gotta figure out a way to get those folks to come spend money in your city. I mean, that's the reality. Any place you look at, people, if you look at Chicago, there's a lot of populace in the city, but a lot of people they come to the neighborhoods, the poor neighborhoods, and spend money. You could go shop in 7 days in any neighborhood in Chicago, and people are spending money. And they're not from those particular neighborhoods. They're traveling in from somewhere else to spend money, and you have to have leadership that's willing to mend the fences. And the reality of it is, I have friends from all over Metro Detroit and had numerous conversations with people. People haven't gotten over 1967. There's still families that feel like black people took my city from me. They haven't gotten over that. And they teach that to their grandkids. They teach that to their children. So you gotta have some leadership that can come in and mend those fences and say, look, this is our city, all of our city, white or black.
Perhaps we should ask Rodney's wife to reconsider.
And before the next question, John, I want to alert you, there's also some questions on that side a little bit further back.
the suburbs of Detroit, and I'm curious, do you think if there's some sort of like opinion that I don't know Detroit, and so I shouldn't be there or something like that? I don't want to step on toes or anything like that, and so those are my two questions.
I don't know who wants to answer that. If you want to answer that, fine. I got something to say, but you can.
Go ahead.
No, again, I go back to the book that we just did, and my co-author, Richard Thomas, always makes sure that we say a lot about it, and I'm pleased to do that. Throughout Detroit's history, and this opportunity still exists today, there have always been groups willing to work on these matters, interracial group, multiracial group, always working hard to bring about improvement. And Detroit is full of that in terms of history. They tried. In fact, they're the heroes of this book, in fact, because they tried hard to change that place, honestly trying to do it, but it was so difficult to do. And those opportunities still exist. I mean, there's Focus Hope in Detroit, there's the Metropolitan Fair Housing Center. These are organizations, there is the, the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion, which is also in Detroit. There are organizations already there that are trying to do some things. If you join those, you could do quite a bit. They would welcome you, I'm sure, and you feel much at home. Because they, again, multiracial, joint mission to do it together, and they've always done that. So that's what you need to do.
I agree with Joe, but I would add to it that there are those who will say that you don't belong there. And you have to get thick skin and not pay any attention to that. That's sometimes not as easy as said. But yeah, you're going to have people say ignorant things. Some have been hurt, some are just ignorant. They're going to tell you, but your commitment has to be, really real. There are a lot of good people there, but the naysayers are there. I'm amazed that, and my feelings get hurt. When I speak and I do things outside of Detroit, some of the, even when I write op-eds, I get some very dastardly, dark, evil blogs and things said to me and called into our office to the point now that I don't look. I can't take it anymore. It does hurt. It's very crippling. I can't believe some of the things that we just said recently with Kwame Kilpatrick being convicted. That for some people, that wasn't enough. They could have brought him to the center of Detroit and quartered him. I don't know if that would have been enough. And, so this is an ugly time right now. I think we really need to practice more being agreeable even when we don't agree. And I think that's what's missing in humanitarian. So I applaud you. I hope you do work. I've had some excellent students out of my classes over the last decade that have made quite a contribution. But it's tough.
Hello. Pardon me if I end up repeating the question that was just asked, but I was born in Detroit, but I moved with my family to the suburbs when I was 2, so I grew up in the suburbs, and what I've come to learn living in the suburbs is that a lot of people are willing to claim Detroit when it comes to sports or entertainment or downtown or a lot of things the good things that Detroit is known for, but when it comes to the harsher realities of crime or lack of access to education, mismanaged funds, inequality, and things like that, a lot of people who live in the suburbs are like, oh, well, I don't live there, I'm not really a part of that, that's not my problem. Or you also have some people like me who are concerned about the condition of Detroit, but maybe feel like maybe they don't have a right to defend the city or really work for what the city needs because they don't have that personal connection to Detroit, or have that experience of living in Detroit or being a real Detroiter. So my question is, do you think there's any way, other than moving back to the city, because sometimes it's not feasible for a lot of people, but do you think there's any way to remake that consciousness that a lot of people who live in the suburbs have and help them really think of themselves as more connected to the city so that they can be more invested in it and feel more accountable for the city of Detroit and what happens in it?
Well, from where I sit, I think the first biggest thing that has to happen is that we have to changed the media's mindset of how they report Detroit. Like I remember I played on Fox 2 Saturday morning to promote a program that I just started across Michigan. And there's a brother by the name of Antonio Hart, who's from Baltimore, who was on television with me on Saturday morning. So we had to go Detroit 7. We got there 7:30 in the morning, went on at about 8. And we sat and watched the news segment. And it blew his mind. Because we sat and watched a 5-minute segment where they reported almost every murder that happened in the last week. I have never seen that in any, and I don't live in Detroit anymore, I live here in Lansing. And I watch the local news here, and I watch the local news in every city. I had never, and I forgot about this because I lived in Detroit and used to watch the news. They reported every murder that happened in the past week, right? So it was upsetting. It was like, this crime happened, that crime happened, a black male, they was a scene in the suspect, a black male, blah, 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 blah. And if they don't mention the person, you knew that they were white, that committed the crime. They didn't mention their race. And so they went on and on and on. And this brother, I'm standing next to him, he's like, man, how could people take this? They had a 5-minute segment on the news just about murders and crimes that happened in the city. I remember growing up as a kid in Detroit, and I lived in a beautiful neighborhood. Everybody had manicured lawns. You couldn't get on anybody's porch and mess with anybody on their house without somebody in the neighborhood. We community policed. Like Carl described, I was everybody in the neighborhood's kid. I couldn't get away with doing anything wrong. And they would book me. Right? And like he said, I didn't want my parents to know. That's not what I saw in the news. What I saw in the news was that this murder happened, this crime happened, this person did this school is failing, this person is corrupt, right? But I never saw on the news what I never saw was the fact that the mayor wanted to build public transit that went to the suburbs. Nobody ever talked about the fact that the suburban mayors didn't want it. He built a people mover where it's supposed to go to 5 main arteries of Detroit, connecting the suburbs to the city. The mayors in the other cities blocked it. You ever heard that before? Nobody talked about that, right? Well, what I did hear about is every murder and every crime that happened in the city, right? That's the only thing I've ever heard about, growing up in the city. So the first thing is the mayor's office has to sit down with local media and talk about how they can help promote the good news in Detroit. You wouldn't know that there was foundations that were supporting the arts in Detroit. You know, we have Skillman Foundation, Knight Foundation. We have Gretchen Verlaine, who's the owner of Carhartt Clothing, who supports the Detroit Jazz Festival, who promotes. I never hear about any of that stuff in the paper. But all of these positive things are happening.
Yeah, but let me say something about that. He brought up something, I didn't do it again, but he brought up something very interesting, that the media, and this is just not in Detroit, this is a nationwide thing. Whenever it involves crime, race is mentioned. Well, it has nothing to do with it, really. Race is not going to help doing it. But what it does, it reinforces the stereotype that crime and blacks are highly correlated. And so, like I said, when they don't mention the race, I read it, where is the racist person? When they don't mention it, we agree, it's a white person. And that happened not just in Detroit, it happened throughout the U.S. And I've seen it, and you probably see it too. What it does, whenever they say it's a black male, it reinforces the stereotype. And so, in a sense, the media perpetuates that stereotype by doing that. Another thing that we mentioned in the book, we have a chapter here that talks about the economic restructuring, drugs, and crime. And one thing that also is reinforced is drug usage. Now, the young people in Detroit do not use drugs as much as whites do. They get arrested for it, but they don't use them as much. And so, in a sense, what you get is a stereotype that said these blacks use drugs. But they really don't, based on the data. We looked at the data on drug usage throughout the United States, and they don't use them much. But because they get arrested and they report that it was a black who was on drugs, the stereotype gets reinforced. That's what happens a lot. So you have to look beyond what the media reports sometimes and go underneath that and look at the actual data, which is very difficult to do, but the media reinforces this stuff.
just want to reiterate that in terms of media. Even when I was looking at images for Detroit, if you do in a Google search, you see more torn down buildings, broken houses, abandoned homes, than you do any of the nice stuff that's going on. And there is so much creativity and entrepreneurship that is going on in the city. There are a lot of college kids moving back into the city. If you look at the population, not that's there right now, but if you look at the population that's moving in, it's college students, young professionals, and foreign-born. So that gives you a sense of, yes, you do have a place there, and it is the young people, it is your generation that will make the difference.
To piggyback off of what she was, saying, I mean, and also I have a question after, but there's this thing called OpportunityDetroit.com, and I highly suggest all of you just taking maybe 2 seconds to look at it. It shows like things you can go do, like operas, concerts, and then it shows all the different types of jobs. I know Quicken Loans is putting more firms in. Blue Cross Blue Shield, all of that stuff is coming in Detroit, and it kind of just shows you, I guess, the more positive media look on what's happening in Detroit instead of the negativity. And I just wanted to give you guys maybe like a little more like an example, so you can actually see. And it has articles from New York Times, everything, just kind of saying how Detroit's kind of on the map, kind of coming back, and it's really interesting, and I highly suggest you check it out. And then my question is kind of, I'm 20 years old, I just turned 20 today, so I don't really know exactly firsthand the history of Detroit. I know, I've learned from my grandparents and my mom and dad who, all lived in Detroit, that it was such a beautiful place, and that I want to know exactly when did it start as like becoming a reality where it was getting bad, that why didn't we kind of do something then, or why can't we just push it under the rug, or I don't know, why didn't we start something? Because I feel if I was at that point in my life that I am now, and it was starting to snowball down, I feel like a lot of people would definitely, would want to react a little bit.
Yeah, loaded question. No,
That's a tough one.
I think that for me, as a native, that it's like I went to bed the night before the riot, and I woke up the next day. The riot, to me, was the pivotal turn. To me, I'm not speaking for anyone else, but Detroit was a great city. The bus was running, everything was working. I also was insulated from the police brutality and all that. I was a pretty happy kid. And then it blew up, and then nothing has ever been the same. Communities were gutted, like Joe said. We don't have grocery stores in most of the communities, and we don't have fresh food, despite what everybody's saying. I'm telling you, I'm on the ground, and so it's not there. The beauty that everybody's talking about, you can't even get downtown unless you have a car. Right. The neighborhoods are just, many of them are gone, but at the same time, Rodney was just pointing out, you have great neighborhoods like Sherwood Forest, Indian Village, and others, so it's not all lost. But I don't think you should downplay. The ugly is really ugly. Yeah. So for me in 1967, July the 23rd, to me is when it took a pivotal turn for the worse.
And for me, the thing, I think that when people want to ignore, 1984 was a year for me. And what it was, I lived in a beautiful neighborhood on the east side of Detroit, where there was a mother and father in every household. People grew gardens, people were supportive of one another. We had concerts in the park. In 1984, there was so much crack cocaine in Detroit that I knew so many people that were on drugs. And I also am the age where I have to admit to you all, yes, I did smoke marijuana. If you didn't believe that. But in 1984, there was no marijuana available, but they were giving away crack cocaine. And that's something people never want to talk about. It changed my neighborhood, because then I started to see grandparents raising their children. The folks that were selling it. And then all of a sudden you start to see, my wife and I got married in the late 80s, and we start to begin to see the people that were our age, overabundance of folks addicted to the drug, and that their parents are now raising their children. And you can't, I witnessed that, I didn't read that in the book, I saw that with my own two eyes.
I have a question. Since you all are with MSU, and I know Carl is with Extension and Outreach, and Rodney's done some work down in Detroit, what do you see the role of Michigan State in this Detroit issue? Not as an author or a selectress, but MSU itself. What's MSU's role in Detroit?
Run. I like how you shifted. Well, I think that there's attempts. I mean, I can't speak to everything that's going on. I know Carl is very active, and I've been very active as well. About 12 years ago, 14 years ago actually, when I took over as the director of jazz studies, it had concerned me that I was going to start a degree program that didn't include students from Detroit. And so I started an outreach program where I would go into all of the high schools and perform, bring my students in, many of which who were not from Detroit, or most of the students at that time were either from Grand Rapids, mid-Michigan, and not a lot of kids from southeastern Michigan that were involved in my jazz program. And immediately we began to recruit students from Detroit to come into the program here at MSU. But then I since expanded that with our organization called Arts League of Michigan, where we started a Saturday program where we taught somewhere like 50 to 60 kids every Saturday jazz, many of which who went on to go to college, not necessarily MSU, but it was my goal that every kid from the program would attend a college. Also, I was the director of a program with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, where my MSU students went in as mentors. And then also I got involved with Carl's brother at Youthville, and so I had a jazz program at Youthville. And since in the last couple of years I'm not doing it as much because more of the universities now, University of Michigan has stepped up, Wayne State has stepped up, and various institutions around that area are now providing jazz education, and the grant money becomes a competition. So I stepped back primarily because there's so many other people who are in that role to do it. And I still come in and doing concerts in the city of Detroit. And I think that I look at it, I think about being if I was the mayor now, not that I would do that, I would reach out to the university and get a coalition of students to come in, much like study abroad programs, but create programs where I could get students from Western Michigan, University of Michigan, Michigan State, and all the various Wayne State institutions around Michigan to come into our community and to do tutoring programs, to do cleanup, to help with, something like Habitat for Humanity, come into the communities and neighborhoods and clean it up. I believe in that. You could easily organize programs like that through the universities, and I think they would love to be a part of something like that.
Yeah, I would second all of that. I think that I consider myself an activist scholar, and I'm not even really comfortable with the word outreach. For me, I don't think I'm outreaching a damn thing. This is the work I do, this is where I work, no different than others, where they work where the issues are. So I work in the city, and I work in other cities. It's very important for my students across the board that they are part of that. And so I start them off slow. Some of my best students that went on to graduate school have been students from outside of Detroit. I think it's important that you bridge this whole question of humanity. I really do. I don't think that you have any borders. Somebody said something very wicked to me recently that I was only concerned about chocolate folks and chocolate students. And I was profane in my rebuttal. But I was saying that, quite frankly, that I'm concerned about all children, all students, nationally, locally, state-wise, and internationally. I want my students to feel the pulse of what's going on into a global community, and I don't see the separation. And all my colleagues here that I know, that's what they do. So I can go to Joe Darden. Joe Darden fights like hell sometimes with me, and he's older, so he beats me. But the fact is that I see us as an activist. That is part of my activism. and like Rodney. So I see us we're spearheading at times. Sometimes we have big fights that we don't agree upon things. I like the fact that other universities in Detroit have been influenced by the leadership, such as what Rodney is doing with music. They should have been doing things. I have to be diplomatic and nice. But I think it's a shame that some of the Detroit universities located there have been very selective in what they're doing. And I think we're much stronger when we come together in a voice that speaks to humanitarian issues. That's the problem I see with Detroit. We don't look at Detroit as people. That's really behind closed doors. We don't see little babies the same as our children. The litmus test for prisons and everything is what's good for my kid is good for Detroit kids. That's how I measure it. So that's what I say about these universities.
John, I think there was a question.
Well, actually, I'm only calling on people who haven't had a question already. I've got one last one here, then we'll move to, but I have to say, before we move on, that if he denies it a third time about running for mayor, get out the bumper stickers, okay? Here we go, the last question.
For Professor Darden and Professor Taylor, either or both, preferably, of cities, Rust Belt cities in particular, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia maybe, that have achieved some economic revival in the last decade or so, what have they done that Detroit hasn't done or has to do yet?
Let me say this. Detroit, within the metropolitan context, is a metropolitan area of extremes. Extremely racially and class divided. Pittsburgh is not like that. No other place is like that in the country, in fact. The closest one will be metropolitan Milwaukee. But that's one problem. The racial divide has been so intense that it's difficult to get cooperation between city and suburb. And it is also difficult to get cooperation within the city of Detroit when it comes to racially uniting the effort. That's the problem. So it's a matter, again, of leadership. It goes back to that in terms of leadership. Pittsburgh had very good leadership, by the way, to transform that thing and turn it around. Detroit has also not been blessed with very effective leadership. And that cuts across racial lines. It hasn't been that effective. It hasn't been that good. And that's a problem. And so we need to have good leadership to turn it around. People with a vision to make sure that they can do it. Move away at times from the auto industry, which dominated the place for years. Pittsburgh moved away from steel, transformed the place, and that's what you have to do. But it's all because of leadership is what brought it about in those places. And that's what you have to do in Detroit. If it will ever happen, that's what you'll need.
I don't know. I think Joe did an excellent job there. Seriously. I think that, I would have to say leadership also. But I would also go back, when we say leadership, are we really meaning politicians or folks at a certain place? I think we have to look at, I feel strongly that we have to look at the leadership of families. That we're not dealing with families, and so that you make good decisions even during tough times. We're seeing things that we have not seen before that are just unacceptable, beginning at families. And so we haven't had that serious conversation. We have not had the conversation to remove the mote from our own eye in that capacity. If we could begin with families and talking about children without fathers and about marriage and all these things that some people think are bygone, I don't agree with that. What established me, and I mean this very seriously, I had other brothers, was that my old man laid the law. He laid the law, he taught me how to tie my tie, and all this sounds corny, and I miss him. But when I was 13 years old, he passed. He said, anything happened to me, you're the firstborn. This is yours, buddy. You got to do your part. And my mother, she was tough. When she got pissed at us, she said, you just stand up and be a man like your father expects you. And I was laughing at an old teammate. Here, he came this week and I said, oh, well, back in the day, I know this is all, if I had my girlfriend pregnant, forget about it. You were going to work, buddy. You were getting married. There was those things. Some people laugh at that. I don't think those tenets, those values are exclusive to anyone. I think it begins with family leadership. I really do.
There's there's been a subtext tonight that we actually didn't take on as head-on as I thought we might. And there was a question that I said was a loaded question. Really, it's the answer is loaded about when the change started, you know, how did it happen and where was everybody? And there was a point in history, not just for Detroit, but for lots of urban areas where it's credited to a man named Robert Moses and the highway system. And those highway systems went through established black communities. You pick any city, the highways went through established black communities. All of a sudden they were destroyed. And the hearts of cities were destroyed. Established middle-class communities, regardless of the mix. And there were some pretty interracial communities. And so now you're taking working class and middle-class communities and just utterly destroying them. People are displaced with no place else to go. And in Detroit, what made it particularly interesting, and Joe alluded to this, was the divide. You had white flight followed by middle-class black flight. Well, who's left in the city? The people that feel that they have nowhere to go. You look at some other cities. Newark is a city trying to combat the difference. The black middle class laid a stake in the ground and said, we're staying. We're fighting for our city, and we're going to do whatever it takes to turn it around. And so this whole idea that somebody has to have a stake in the game and feel like we're going to speak up, and it's not everybody else, it's us. And so how do we get to that? It's us. And the community idea, I mean, many of us who are over a certain age, we won't name the age, can talk about being raised by the entire community, right? So what happened and when did it become okay to say that we're going to walk away from our fellow human beings? So when we look at Detroit, Detroit is really just a microcosm of where we are in the U.S., but it's so poignant because of the race and class issue. And so if we can't solve Detroit, what does that say for us as a nation, as it keeps snowballing out of control elsewhere? So I want to really thank the panel tonight for bringing these issues before us. I know that there are many more questions that we could ask, and we could continue on. We try to end a little before the hour so that you can come and ask them additional questions. And I'm just going to ask right now if you would just take a moment and thank them for their time. Sharper focus, wider lens forums in the spring semester. Thank you.
Back because I was trying to make sure I didn't have a present. Thank you for coming.
Nancy.
It's okay. It's a 1960s tribute band.
I love these kinds of things. I love these kinds of things.
My baby brother is now a student.
We got oh, of course we are. Let's follow Mike. Let's get in trouble.
That's a big shot. And also,